affirmative speaker to begin the debate.
For the last 40 years, honourable Democrats across the South have been shouting in the wilderness and achieving nothing. Because despite the fact that elements of their message are deeply appealing, they represent a brand which is so tainted across the area that they're unable to champion, unable to enact their programme. And the results of that are written in the faces of people across the South who've experienced suffering because of it. They're written in Mississippi, being half as rich as the richest state in the Union. They're written in the average African American across the South, living a full 15 years less than the average white person, because those policies are so ineffective and have failed so disastrously. We might care to some extent about the name Democrat, but side opposition's murder here today is to prove we should care more about that than 15 years of someone's life, because we can't enact the policies that person needs. What do we stand for on proposition? We think that across the Deep South, the Southern Leadership Council areas, the states of the former Confederacy, excluding Virginia and Florida, where the Democrats are viable to some extent electorally, where they have been in other areas where they've been consistently defeated, moderate Democratic governors across that area, such as Jim Webb or even Bill Clinton when he was the governor of Arkansas, should step away from a brand which is tainted and build a brand which should get something done and improve people's lives. We do not envisage that people would be running for president because the presidential elections are ill-suited towards a three-party system. What we do envisage is this: they would contest every gubernatorial election and fight hard for their values. They would fight to be in the House of Representatives and the Senate and to be in state legislatures where they can get things done for their constituents. Then they should work with everyone to get policies which work for the South. We'd be happy for them to endorse presidential candidates in primaries or elections who'd be pursuing values which would be effective and which would help to lift people out of poverty. Presumably they would have endorsed, for instance, Nixon over Humphrey in 1968, or they'd endorsed Kasich and Kasich in the most recent round of Republican elections as their candidate. We think that this will lead to fundamental change in the way the South is treated, and it won't be left behind, and its most vulnerable citizens will no longer be left to languish in poverty. So two arguments in this first speech. Firstly, why we think this party is electorally viable in a way the Democratic Party never will be. And secondly, why that transforms lives, especially the lives of those who've been suffering too long, because no one has cared about them and there's been no voice to speak for them. Firstly, why we think this party is electorally viable. You have to note that the US is a continent more than a country. This is a nation of 250 million people, of 50 states, which is divided between millions of viewpoints. We think that two parties cannot possibly accommodate the range of ideological varieties which take place across the states. This means that in some areas, those parties are going to be frankly entirely misaligned with the political reality of the people on the ground and what they want to be voting for when they go to the ballot box. We think that in the area where that misalignment is most profound, i.e. the South in these areas, we think people should have a choice to vote for in reality, rather than being able to force to divide key elements of their values. Why is that currently taking place? Because the Democrats are seen as Ivy League, northeastern liberals who aren't concerned about people living in these areas, whilst Republicans are able to appeal to social conservatism in a way which allows them to neglect the true economic interests of these areas, which will often benefit significantly more from state support or state investment, which they're never receiving at the moment. Why is it that the social conservatism of the Republicans is able to triumph over economic interests in many cases? Because there are strong cultural traditions which are ingrained and which opposition can't just wish away. But secondly, because church groups are among the most organised groupings in these areas, which allows them to assume a political dominance. Note the presence of Ted Cruz very strongly across the South because he has such strong links in evangelical communities. However, despite these social conservatism, which leads to people to flock to Republicans when they head into the ballot box, these people's economic interests are very often much, much more complicated. So note these are the poorest areas. Mississippi is much poorer than any other state in the Union which could be named. We think these are the areas which deserve the most support, but they're getting the least because those they elect are consistently ideologically opposed to helping the people when they need it. With the exception of Texas and Oklahoma, these are therefore relatively economically weak states which have been consistently failed. Consistently failed because their industry has been allowed to wither and die, and because the Tennessee Valley Authority did nothing for them and failed to invest. We note, therefore, that there is an opening for people to stand on a value platform which is more compatible with both the interests and the values of people across this area to win and to get things done. How do we know this? We know this because third-party candidates, separate from the Democrats, but espousing a value system similar to whatever our new party, the Popular Party, is going to be espousing, can stand for. We think they'll be able to therefore win votes from both sides in the same way the previous parties have. Note, firstly, the name value of the people who are defecting to this party. Individuals like Al Gore, or even Bill Clinton when he was governor of Arkansas, have an immense ability to take voters with them through personal loyalty and bonds. Secondly, because people have done so in the past successfully as third-party candidates. Note, Ross Perot winning many votes across the South and 20% of votes across the entirety of the nation, especially in the South, despite the fact he ignored all his campaign advisors and implied the Republicans were using dogs to spy on him. This shows the potential for attracting the votes of people across the South if there was an ideologically compatible platform to do so. Thirdly, the captured group of Southern voters has been catered for exceptionally badly because congressional leadership of both sides have been able to ignore them and to ignore their interests. Note that there has been investment in highway systems and infrastructure across Florida and Ohio because they're contested, but there is not one interstate highway in Alabama because there's been such a lack of interest in investment in that areas. We think what this means is it's just the weak underbelly of a party which is failing to provide, and when it's attacked we can get real change and real options. How did this change come about? On a federal level, when people are elected, they are able to swing change because the deadlock in the Senate is such that 5 or 6 votes offer crucial changes and crucial leverage, such they'll be able to drive policies which actually benefit people in these areas. They'll be able to drive real investments so African American children get a decent level of education. But secondly, on a state level, where the vast majority of the money is actually spent, which exercise control over most federal programs, we think these people can probably get control in maybe a plurality or at least a very significant minority of states. This matters because Bobby Jindal directly vetoing federal assistance to a state in the form of Obamacare means that African Americans in that state are unable to access healthcare, and it's the same across the rest of the South, where federal programs designed to help those in poverty systematically fail because those people who pretend to be standing up for those in that area don't do so because their broader ideological imperatives prevent them from doing so, and they're able to get around that by using their social values to bash the Democratic Party. But secondly, it changes the way the Republican Party works in these areas. Note, the Republican Party in Ohio would never dream of running purely on social policy alone, but runs on what's best for the people in that area. You see an entirely different sort of Republican who's more pragmatic, more willing to work for economic change through state investment and through whatever works pragmatically, rather than Ted Cruz people who want to shout in the wilderness about the Constitution, about social values. Fundamentally, this is a region which has been forgotten for 50 years, whose people have languished in poverty and despair, and we think we owe them better on side proposition.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Bring back the first negative to begin the case for that side.
So I was sitting there kind of amused for the first 5 minutes of Raffy's speech, when he consistently refused to tell you what these people would actually stand for. And about minute 5, he finally said they'd essentially ditch every progressive social policy movement the Democrats have ever stood for. I finally understood why, because essentially what they're doing is they're throwing every gay person in the South under the bus. They're throwing every woman who wants contraception or abortion in the South under the bus. They're throwing essentially every single minority under the bus by ditching the progressive social agenda the Democratic Party is aspiring to in pursuit of a purely economic agenda. That's not something we're willing to stand for on TV England. So what exactly do we stand for? We stand for a broadly unified Democratic Party nationally. We support the Democratic Party devoting more resources than it currently does, resources similar to the resources the Republican Party devotes to campaigning on the state level, a massive imbalance they currently don't have and actually addresses a lot of the concerns they want us to talk about. And finally, we're okay with things like the Red Dog Democrats. We're okay with Democrats campaigning in a slightly more conservative fashion within conservative states if that's absolutely necessary. What we don't support is them removing themselves entirely from the Democratic Party as a whole, throwing all the values and principles that make the Democratic Party great under the bus. So what's our case then? I'm going to tell you firstly about national politics, why that becomes significantly worse on their side of the house. Secondly, state politics, why that unsurprisingly also becomes sufficiently worse on their side of the house. And Rosa is going to tell you a lot more details about why this is atrocious, atrocious, atrocious for minorities in these areas in a really nasty way. Most of my rebuttals are actually going to be integrated in my material, but a couple of things to note first. Firstly, hilariously, our burden is not what Raffy says, that you have to stand for the name of the Democratic Party above all else. Clearly our burden's about what's better or worse for American politics. But secondly, and probably far, far more importantly, let's drill down deeper into this core idea of we need to get people to act in their economic interests. I'm glad that Raffy and MDG and Harish decided they know what the economic interests are of several hundred million people in the South. That's really wonderful for them. A couple of things to note here. Firstly, they didn't actually give us very many reasons why Republican economic policy was necessarily better or worse. They talked a lot about the legacy of slavery. They gave us a lot of statistics about why Mississippi is poor. We posit there are lots of historical reasons why Mississippi is disproportionately poorer than New York, no less than it's quite far away from the main Atlantic trade routes and stuff. There are lots of reasons they need to give us actual analysis about why those things are necessarily worse. Secondly, on none of this though, there are reasons why people would actually necessarily move away from the Republican Party towards the Democratic Party, assuming that the only reason Republican voters support the Republican Party is they hate gay people and they hate abortions. We tell you that's not true. There's a hell of a lot of people, probably the majority of Republican voters, who actually deeply, deeply believe in the economic message of aspiration and freedom and the American dream that they've been told. When Mitt Romney stands up and decries the inheritance tax, a very progressive measure, as the death tax and wants to increase the threshold to above 2 million, something that most people in the crowd he was talking to would never earn, people cheered, right? And people cheered because regardless of how much MDG thinks it's false consciousness, inherently still people believe in this message. It's not clear why that would necessarily change. Ditto, that's true, a lot of these church groups. They want to talk about the influence of people like Ted Cruz, the church groups that support them. A lot of these church groups, the single biggest purveyors of this economically conservative message, right? Ben Carson, who's even more backed by the church groups than Ted Cruz was, supported his tax policy being based on tithes, a tax policy that notes reduced the base level income tax something like 10%, right? So the church groups doesn't necessarily stand. Finally, and very briefly, a lot of the kind of progressive change that actually needs to happen in these areas involves targeting deep-set racial inequality, things like affirmative action. These explicitly are the things that are being ditched by their agenda because they want to appeal to the kind of Donald Trump-esque white voters who they necessarily need to appeal to for them to win this motion. They're going to have to ditch affirmative action. They're going to have to ditch investing disproportionately in disenfranchised black ghettos in the city, right? All of that hits right at the heart of their case. Moving on then, though, let's look at national politics. So ultimately, national politics, no one's going to dispute this in this debate, is hugely, hugely important. Because although the United States is allegedly a system of states, allegedly confederate and so on, ultimately the federal government has had more and more power over the past 200 years, to the point it's one of the most important power brokers in the state. It does most fiscal policy, right? Things like federal minimum wage are all done at the federal level, let alone stuff like foreign policy, which is also done at the federal level. What happens here is it screws it hugely disproportionately in favour of the Republican Party. Our stance in England is essentially ambivalent towards the Republican Party, right? We don't have a very strong stance whether they're great or terrible. We just don't want democracy to be hugely skewed. But if we're taking them on their logic, they seem to hate them, so that's fine. That's even better for us in that case. All right, two big areas in which national politics is hugely skewed. Firstly, presidential elections are completely screwed up by this policy, right? Because what you need in a presidential election, this is the first sub-point within this, is you need a very devoted activist base. You need, especially in states that have caucuses rather than primaries, where it's even more important to physically get people out of their houses, not just into a polling booth, but into a room where they can sit there for 2 hours and arrange themselves in various little groups. It's really important that you have a unified base of activists who can actually pursue that change. When the leaders of these parties, Raffy said they endorsed moderate Republicans. Presumably some of them would endorse moderate Republicans, some of them would endorse Democrats because their views are something of a melange between the two, right? That's inherent within the motion. Therefore, some leaders in these parties are going to say vote Kasich, some are going to say vote Hillary, some are going to say vote Bernie. Crucially, there's no unified message within this party, and therefore it's very, very hard to organise people, especially in primaries, but even in general elections, to get out the vote, to get people moving, to get people organised, and to get people fundamentally voting. Beyond just that, though, and secondly under this, we tell you the perception of the Democratic Party is hugely altered. The Democratic Party pretty much abandons this state as soon as, necessary in their policy, right? They start losing elections. If you say this state is a red state, the Democrats don't care about you. If you don't have Democrats campaigning around you in the state elections, if you don't have Democrats in the state house, you can't point to like X state law initiative the Democrats passed that really improve your lives. People are far less attached to that party, and that's going to transfer to them not voting in presidential elections as well. Secondly, though, under Congress, the point at which the Democrat Party is hugely fragmented, basically in like, not in one chunk, but in two like smaller chunks, which caucus separately. You can't have three-line whips because there's not like any kind of leverage that the party leadership has over these people because they're entirely organisationally independent. Then the opposition's just going to be really, really bad. For like ordinary kind of voting and so on, it means the Republicans can a lot easier kind of divide and conquer, like move particular people and gain particular advantages over them. But this is especially bad, we tell you, in the context of constitutional amendments. And certainly in the context of US politics right now, the Republicans do have a majority to pass things. They don't have a majority to pass constitutional amendments. When they can win some of these people over to pass crazy things like the balanced budget amendment, it's going to wreak absolute havoc in the United States. That's a horrific, horrific harm. Secondly, let's talk a bit more about state politics. 3 reasons why the Democrats become far less effective in state politics, and that's why it's quite bad. Firstly, involvement. Ultimately, the youth vote, which is probably the people who are most politically active because they're students, they have lots of time, they're quite politically active, like CF debating, is quite democratic. Look at the like huge turnout Bernie Sanders has seen disproportionately among youth. They're the people who volunteer the most. These are the people who also volunteer the most primarily because of social issues. They really care about like gay rights, they really care about women, all these things that their party is ditching. At that point, you get very, very low turnout by these groups. You get them being disengaged from politics, you get them not participating in the process, you get it even more skewed towards the conservative elite that they claim to oppose. Secondly, though, you lose change at the local level, because ultimately, even if they're not winning House of Representative seats a lot of the time, often they are, they're certainly winning mayorships in big cities, districts, like large chunks of the country, areas where you can still affect like numerous policy changes, all of which is ditched when they have this diluted message, which is far, far more effective. Beyond just that, though, even if they're in a minority, someone like Wendy Davis in the Texas legislature doing an 8-hour-long filibuster against abortion is really, really powerful and emotive as a message. They don't get that on their side of the house because they ditch opposition to abortion laws. Thirdly and finally, though, let's talk a bit about tribal affiliation, because American politics is very, very polarized. Essentially, most Republicans identify as Republicans, not just because of issues, but I'm a Republican, my father is a Republican, all my family's a Republican. Note that most people can't see their children dating someone from the other party and say they'd oppose them getting married, right? That's the level of polarization we're seeing in America. So the Republican bloc would likely stay very cohesive. When they fragment the Democratic bloc, that's only going to help the Republicans, as if anything, some of them at least will move towards the Republican Party. That means you get even more Republican dominance within the state legislature. Ultimately, we tell you, a house divided cannot stand. Vote Abraham Lincoln, vote side opposition.
Thank the speaker for that speech. And back to the second speaker for the negative team to continue.
You need a timer.
Yeah, that would be great. Archie might have lost my phone.
Well, we've heard from proposition of some really great arguments. But the thing is, they're all arguments about why we should create a third party in the Deep South in America. They're not arguments about why we should destroy the Democrat Party, take away the ability of anyone to vote for any progressive social issues, and build a party out of the rubble that will be able to do nothing. And that's where proposition fundamentally fall down on this debate. So today I'm going to be talking about why we actually don't have to pick our battles when people are suffering due to the lack of social issues that are being raised. But before I do that, 2 major points of rebuttal. So firstly, it seems like the major contention we have from proposition is that under the status quo, people in the South really don't know what they're voting for. So time and time again, they vote Republican. That seriously harms their interests. So 3 responses to this. Firstly, we point you to what Archie told you in his speech, which never really went responded to, about the fact that there is a plethora of reasons that people vote Republican. It is simply not true that everyone in the South is an automaton who only votes Republican because of the branding and because they're told to do so. There's many reasons, because they simply just believe in the economic policies that are being espoused by that party, because they feel like their community is Republican and they want to continue to vote in that way, even if it damages their interests as an individual. We simply don't think it's true that all of these people are brainwashed people who don't understand what they're voting for. In fact, we think it's offensive that they would suggest that that's the only reason that anyone votes Republican. Secondly, we think that actually this is changing anyway. Due to kind of demographic changes we already see and the rise in young people voting, we point you to the fact that Texas is going to become like a purple state soon due to the changing demographics in these southern states in the first place. We simply don't think it's true that these states are just inherently red and will never change, therefore we have to like change the party that is in them. We don't buy that either. But finally and thirdly, okay, let's take you on your ground. If this is about branding, if the only reason anyone votes Republican is because they're told to from birth and they don't feel they have to, why are they going to vote for your new popular party? Why are they going to vote for a party which is literally run by people who used to be Democrat candidates? Why are they going to vote for like Democrat, the shiny 3.0? They're not going to change if they really only vote on branding. So even under your side of the house, even using your own logic, no one votes for this party, meaning all of the benefits that you brought us simply don't happen under your side of the house. So secondly, let's look at activism, which Archie talked a lot about in his speech. So after being the side that told us that it's all about branding, they then came back and told us that actually no. The real reason that people are activists, the real reason that people get involved, is not actually to do with branding or the party. That's not why they turn up to caucuses or primaries. It's actually because of the candidates. Okay, so if you really want to talk about why people turn up to caucuses, if you really want to talk about why people care, let's drill even deeper than that, because it's not really about the candidates, it's about the kind of issues they care about. The reason why young people get galvanized to become involved in politics is not because of the candidates, it's because of the issues that they care about. Usually these issues are not issues of economics, they're issues of social policy that have a significant impact on their lives. The issues they care about, the issues that you are cutting out on your side of the house, thereby limiting activism, as Archie explained. Okay, so now to the issues, the social issues I want to talk about. So this has been touched on throughout the speech, and the only real thing we've heard about this from Proposition so far is that, you know what, it's unfortunate, but things are already bad for these people, little to nothing has been achieved, and we need to pick our battles. We think the people on Proposition do not understand what it is like to live in a southern state where you care about issues such as abortion, when you care about issues such as LGBT rights, when you care about things such as affirmative action projects. The fact is that they want to tell us that the Democrat Party has done nothing for these people under the status quo. But as I'm going to come on to, that's simply not true. So firstly, the power of having a party, even if it is not in power, pushing for those issues, talking about those issues, and making a conversation surrounding those issues is hugely important. As was acknowledged by Proposition, when they said that even if their the popular party don't win, it's still great that they're there. So we both agree that the presence of a party is really important for people in those areas because they see that those issues are being raised. Why? Because the fact is that if you are someone who does care about abortion, if you are someone who does care about LGBT rights, under side Proposition, you now live in a world where literally no party represents that issue, where literally no party cares about it, or talks about it, or seems to worry about it at all. This is not a picking battles issue. The impact on your life of living in a state where no one in politics cares about your issues, or wants to talk about your issues, is massive for a variety of reasons. Firstly, the fact is that never having it discussed and never having it raised by any political parties creates a sense of hopelessness. Essentially what Proposition are telling people is, look, if you live in the South, socially progressive issues are never going to be raised, so there's no point even having a party there for you. The fact is, that state that you live in then becomes defined by the belief that LGBT views don't matter, or abortion issues don't matter, because you're literally telling that state and the people in that state that there is no point in having a party that might talk about those issues there, because they literally will never be raised and that they don't care. The impact of people who live in those areas, who do suffer every day because of those issues, is massive. But furthermore, we want to talk about issues that this has in terms of policy. So we accept that on a national level, most of these rights we're talking about are protected. So on a federal level, like the issues of like the rights of LGBT people, affirmative action projects, abortion clinics are generally supported by the American government and by the people in the US. But we see time and time again that these things aren't always actually supported on a local level. So we see in the South like issues of people trying to close down abortion clinics or not really implementing the kind of affirmative action projects that we're talking about. The fact is that this gets so much worse on side Proposition when you don't have a strong voice speaking out about it. So under the status quo, what happens is that even if the Republicans are in power, you still have the pressure and the scrutiny of the Democrat voting bloc, of the Democrat Party, and of Democrat activists who care about these issues, and who will look into these issues, and will pressure people to discuss and talk about these issues in a way that simply won't happen under their side of the house. The fact is that what happens now is that these things are allowed to occur with no pressure, because not only do you now no longer, like, just by virtue of the fact that you don't have a Democrat Party, so you don't have a party that can actually speak out about these things, but furthermore, the entire culture of that state has been told that, like, it doesn't have to worry about these issues in the same way, but it's because it has literally been delineated from the rest of the states in America and told that all these blue states care about progressive issues and all of these states in the South don't have to care about them anymore. The message that sends about the difference in culture between the South and the North of America, the message that sends about whether or not people in your state actually care about you and your struggles, is massive in the kind of people who are going to be speaking out about this kind of policy in the first place. The fact is that the only way to keep things open like abortion clinics, the only way to ensure that affirmative action projects are constantly pursued over a prolonged period of time, not just in the very short term when the actual American government can enforce them, is to have people in those communities speaking out over and over again. When you don't have the Democrat Party, but as Archie talked about, you also don't have the Democrat Party's ability to build up an activist base that is able to continue to speak out over these issues, but you instead cut them out of the conversation, so you don't have a socially progressive body of activists who are able to speak out against them. The kind of beneficial policies we get that the Democrat Party pushed on a national level are significantly less likely to be implemented on a local level. This means essentially what Proposition do is they negate any of the issues faced by people who live in the South, who need the abortion clinics that are being built there, who use those affirmative action projects and use them successfully. Essentially what we got from side Proposition is a side that wanted to pretend that all of the beneficial social things that the Democrat Party has done to the South were unimportant, were not a success, and that this was really a case of picking our battles because the struggle felt by these people doesn't matter, and that is why we are very proud to oppose.
Thank the Speaker for that speech, and to conclude the constructive case for the affirmative side, invite the third speaker.
About 50 years ago, George Wallace was asked, will there ever be dictatorship in the United States? And he responded, yes, but we'll call it democracy. And that is the reality of the United States as you have it now. In the South, you have one-party rule which will perpetuate itself ad infinitum unless challenged. And that challenge cannot come from the Democratic Party as it is right now. That is partly because many voters don't vote rationally on issue after issue after issue, because it takes ages to look through all those issues, an amount of time and amount of effort which most people don't have, but on identity politics. And the Democrats right now are so distinct from what most people believe. They are the Yankees. They are the people of the Ivy League and the educated elite, and not people like you. It is true, voter identification will still mean that many people will turn to the Republican Party exactly as that side of the House says. But it's worth noting that voter identification isn't static. In the 1960s, most people in the South were voting for the Democrats. That changes. One of the reasons that changes is because of different policy dimensions, because different kinds of people attached. Yes, some of these people might still have previously been Democrats. The difference is that they are not Barack Obama. They're probably not Hillary Clinton. They're not the derided Democrats who they absolutely hate. The point is that you do end up with some fluidity. People who voted Democrat or Republican before will not necessarily always vote against what may or may not be in their interest. Several points first. One, let's talk about individuals' interests and how we best understand them. The first thing I want to note is there are certainly going to be individuals in the South, as there are across the entire United States, who may well support conservative economic policies. But we don't actually know that. Why? Because it is going to be socially conservative issues which are going to dominate electoral cycles for a few reasons. One, as Michael tells you, the organizational reality in circumstances where you have low turnout is that church groups have disproportionate power. It is true, some church groups do support Tea Party-esque policies, but that isn't the majority of them, and it has a disproportionate amount of power in the first place. Secondly, we simply don't know. If you care predominantly about social values and one party produces a better economic policy, that's still not one you vote for, because that isn't that's not the determinant strategy when it comes to who you give your vote to. That can change if you offer someone who is both socially conservative and maybe economically liberal. Maybe you end up with a Republican still in power. I think in many circumstances You won't. And that is the difference. At least these become contested. But even if they're right, the point about them being a threat to the Republican Party, the Republican hegemony you otherwise have, still apply. All the things Raffy tells you at the start of his speech about changes to the Republican Party, and they now need to contest at least some of these votes in some of these areas in a way they don't before. And it's at least plausible that these individuals can get elected for all the reasons we tell you, and their identification arguments are simply not as static either historically or logically as they give us. So what are the harms that Centre House wants to talk about? They want to talk about the harms to minorities. The first thing I want to note is I'm not even convinced the Democratic Party under the status quo does what they want to do. I don't think they necessarily represent those views to the extent they want. Look, for instance, at Bill Clinton in 1992, a progressive Southern governor. Does he, for instance, talk about the rights of black people, or does he instead, when he's running for election, go to the South to oversee the execution of a mentally disabled black man to seem like he's strong and hard on crime? These issues are so electorally toxic in many of these cases that they're not being discussed even by these candidates in all but the most extreme circumstances. But maybe we do care about discussion, and all things equal, we rather have that discussion than not. But the reality is this discussion really doesn't go anywhere. For instance, if you support abortion and you always lose, that's often equally toxic in many circumstances, particularly when you don't get the kinds of changes you want. The third point I want to make on this is they claim, well, look, this says it's a huge cultural difference when the Democrats don't even contest these areas. The first thing I want to note is the reason why the Democrats probably shouldn't contest these areas is because they have very little chance of winning. But I think people within the South and the North are already pretty polarized that this is probably very marginal in terms of the differences in those circumstances. So I'm not sure that you end up with these views being articulated in the first place, and I'm not sure it matters. I'm simply not sure it comparatively matters for a couple of reasons. The first is, when it comes to minorities, we're often talking about a diverse group of people who are minorities in different ways. Trivially, that is true. I think this is probably good for many, for instance, racial minorities. Racial minorities within the South are not geographically concentrated in single districts. The reason why that is often true is because you have state houses which are Republican dominated who decide to gerrymander districts to make sure that racial minorities are not in a single area, i.e. it's much harder for the Democrats to get control of a certain area. It is probably beneficial now that you have many more districts being contested. That is when it is beneficial for those people. That's when you end up with people like Body Gentile in Louisiana, maybe a little bit more conciliatory towards these groups. We think they probably gain. When it comes, for instance, to other kinds of minorities, it is unfortunate they will not be able to achieve all the benefits they may in other parts of the United States. But I'm not sure that's actually a comparative in this debate. I'm not sure that is actually what happens. I'm not sure discursively or that that's actually the issues which are brought up, if for no other reason than the Democratic candidates who are even slightly viable, who can get any level of media coverage, are probably not going to be talking about those issues which end up seeming to be so toxic. So I just don't believe that. You don't get policy change. You, by and large, don't even get the kinds of changes you want. And finally, it is worth noting that minorities are not just minorities. They care about other things, like their economic future, and because there is at least a potential now for changes in that areas, we think that is beneficial for our side of the House. Let's talk about the impact on national politics, which our side of the House cared a great deal about. But they say, look, there are several problems they run into. One, when it comes to primaries themselves and the electoral base you have. I think this is probably irrelevant, given by and large organization and primary systems is done by candidates themselves rather than political parties, for the very obvious reason that political parties probably can't endorse a primary candidate when you have contested elections. The second thing I want to note on this is it's very important to realize that the Democratic Party in particular is one which under the status quo is very difficult for it to be separated from the liberal elite at the top of the party. This is important for two reasons. First, they say, why can't we just have a third party? Why do we need to eliminate the Democrats overall? I think the reason you need to do it is they'll probably cannibalize at least a portion of the vote. But secondly, the thing about the Democrats is it's very difficult without a clear break for them to change. This is because the Democrats are even more controlled by the establishment than the Republican Party is. This is obvious, for instance, you look at the role of superdelegates in Democratic conferences, where, for instance, you have individuals who have free votes which aren't determined by the population. This is why the Democratic Party is much harder to separate from that liberal intellectual base. But then they say, well, look, the real problem is that there could be circumstances with constitutional amendments, where this group ends up being a swing minority. But I don't think that's true in the way they decide to present it, because predominantly what these former Southern Democrats will do is take votes and take seats away from Republicans. They probably don't change the balance in the way that's in the House wants to talk about. And more importantly, exactly as Michael tells you from the very start of at the start of his speech, is it's probably useful because you undermine polarization, because you now have groups which both the Republicans and the Democrats can work with. That means that you probably have some consensus over some issues. At the end of this debate, the reality is that the South has been harmed. It is harmed because the voters in the South, the constituencies in the South, are captured. You don't get the economic development you want. You end up only having a small subset of issues being discussed. And maybe, if, for instance, you have that socially conservative but economically welfare policies being driven, they wouldn't win seats. But that isn't the state and the choice they have right now. We live in a fiction when a country with 250 million people, which is effectively a continent, can have its votes structured by two political parties which are not ideologically homogenous, but at least ideologically concentrated. In the area where that's most harmful, it is useful to split one of these parties and end up with contested elections which are beneficial for everyone in that country who are very happy to propose.
Thank the speaker for that speech, and invite the third speaker for the negative.
I'm really quite concerned, and I assume that most of the people in this room also noticed, that when Archie said, guys, you're going to end up throwing all of the minorities in the South of America under the bus, side proposition let out a sly smile and started nodding. But that was picked up again when he said discussion of certain social issues is cute, but we don't really care. On side opposition, we asked them to go and ask someone who is told every day that homosexuality is not acceptable, that no, you can't get an abortion because it fundamentally doesn't align with American values. That points to the fact that they don't really care about the minorities that they claim. They only care insofar as improving the economic circumstances in some of these states, providing the governor of Mississippi with a little bit more cash on payday. Three things in this speech. First of all, will this party get support? Second of all, talking about national and regional politics. And third, minority groups. Let's talk about will this new party get support. We had some analysis as to why this party is unlikely to get this support. It falls into three lines. First of all, that people actually quite like Republican economics. Their response to this was like, what is Republican economics? But we pointed out that if you look at actual poll data, so real people's opinions, it indicates the fact that people quite like low-income taxes when they have very low income to start with. They quite like the idea of what's called low corporation taxes to encourage the very investment that Michael claims is imperative. Second of all, we pointed to the fact that actually, if it's Republican social policy that you're hoping to lure people in with, presumably the Republicans can do their social policy better, and they're certainly more credible at doing it when a perception is put about that is the Democrats in disguise attempting to use the recent successes of Republican social policy in order to canvass more votes. Third of all, and just most importantly, it doesn't really matter the extent to which it's not viable, because you suddenly told all the Democratic voters in South America, by the way, there are some, that suddenly, actually, we're not going to represent you as the Democratic Party. We think it's more important that we achieve our own aims, and our own aims of just gaining power as opposed to truly representing those people. That's problematic at the point at which you haven't actually guaranteed winning much of the Republican vote, because the Republicans do the majority of the things that they like and that you like better, but you have crippled the Democratic Party. Note that the issues we're talking about here are likely to be gone in 30 years. As Archie rightly pointed out to you, when you have immigration into the South of America, for example, in Hispanic communities. But the repeals to the Constitution that the Republicans will bring into play when they have a 2/3 majority are not going to be gone in the next 30 years. What was the response we heard from that? It was like, well, we don't really know if people actually like the Republicans because they've had them forever. And they pointed at the example of Donald Trump trying to tell us that people were yearning for more liberal economic policy. Three responses. One, this is actually just not an argument. You can't point to the absence of something for the support of another. But second of all, we tell you to go and look at actual statistics. Actual polling data tells you they like Republican economics. And it's backed up not just by this polling data, but by reason. Because people like the idea of having investment in communities where there are very few jobs for those people. Third of all, let's deal with this issue of Donald Trump. People like Donald Trump not necessarily because of his economic policy. We actually think the majority of people like Donald Trump for the reasons you yourself hinted to in your case, when you say that he doesn't come from the Harvard-educated background. He seems to cut through the formalities that are slowing down the American political system. Let's talk about national and regional politics. Again, Archie gave you 3 reasons as to why this skews national politics in favour of the Republicans, something that you yourselves do not like. They were that you have a divided activist base, you have fewer Democratic voters, as I've already explained, and the Congress is now more likely to have a majority that allows them to do disastrous things. We didn't really hear a response to that beyond the fact that candidates drive turnout, not party lines, to which I have 2 comments. First of all, you ignore the entirety of Archie's analysis, where he brings you the fact that, like, I identify as a Democrat, not necessarily as a Democrat in and of itself, but as anti-Republican. That is what drives Democratic turnout, at least to some extent. But the point at which you make this party, i.e. fragments of the Democratic Party, more Republican, its basic logic are unlikely to win more Democratic voters. Second of all, it must be noted that there is a tension in their case, at the point at which they simultaneously claim in their third speech that voters will move from party to party on certain issues, like as they please or as takes their fancy, but simultaneously that you will have no progress in terms of, like, in the future, in advancing the Republican policies that people are trying to put forward at the moment. Crucially, the fluidity that they at least recognise to a certain extent is there, backs up our analysis about how actually in the long term this problem is one that resolves itself, and you cripple the Democratic Party for the time when it does. Let's talk about state politics and how that is less effective. Again, 3 reasons. First of all, because youth turnout, on which the Democratic Party primarily relies, especially in these southern areas, is diminished at the point at which you are, as the Democratic Party, one, no longer really a thing on a regional level, but second of all, you're telling those youths that actually you don't care about their issues. That's the point at which youths don't turn out to vote. But second of all, like, at that point at which this new party that you create has a direct incentive to distance itself from democratic values, you lose the kinds of progressive change we've been seeing, at least in part, at the moment. They may not care about discussion in the broad sense of things, and it may well not necessarily have resulted in the past in great change, but we point to the fact that some discussion is better than no discussion. At the point where they don't have any clear benefits to destroying the Democratic Party, we've got a lot of harms, we probably win on that area. But third of all, and finally, is that, like, the affiliations and divisions along party lines mean that Republicans are likely to remain as strong as, because as Archie points out to you, it's not just that, like, I like the Republicans, it's because I live in a community that, as they point out, has voted Republican for the last 50 years. That if I go out with someone from the Democratic Party, my family will ostracize me. Those are the kinds of pressures that lock the Democrats in power, and we don't think there's going to be much change in those areas. But what was the response we heard? We were told that this party represented a better challenge to the Republicans. We were slightly confused for 3 reasons. First of all, it's kind of basic logic, but if you're more like the Republican Party, you are less likely to challenge them. Because crucially, the challenges we think are not ones like, should we challenge the Democratic Party in terms of, like, potentially who has a power balance in these areas. The real the points at which the Democratic Party need to be challenged are the point at which they restrict abortions in the areas that they control, the point at which black youths are shot en masse by police forces. Third of all, and most importantly, like, we've already given you mechanisms by which we can potentially better challenge the Republicans on our side of the House. We were allowing Democrats to become red dog Democrats, not necessarily killing the Democratic Party, but allowing them, if there is such a disparity to be made, to win those votes. Note that you do not have to have a political system hell-bent on imprisoning people, and in fact, potentially having that political system not hell-bent on imprisoning people is a better way of achieving change for these groups than necessarily trying to achieve more jobs for them when they leave prison. Finally, let's talk about these minority groups, because a terrifying number of assertions have been made by the proposition case. Because we told you right from the very start, like, look guys, the basic logic here is you're throwing minorities under the bus. But not only do they seem fine with it, but they came back with 2 responses. First of all, that racial minorities are apparently not concentrated geographically, which means that, like, no matter what the Democrats do, they're not going to be able to help them. That is not only a lie, insofar as they tend to be concentrated in areas, that's why brutality and gang violence are so prevalent in some of these areas, like, engage with reality, guys. But second of all, we do not necessarily need to have geographical concentration beyond the fact that they are in a particular state. Second response they gave us was, like, it's actually more important to maximize the economic interests of these groups. I have 3 points in response to this. First of all, the South needs real investment. That was the line that was promoted from side proposition. But the only, like, kind of assertion as to why this would happen is that the Democrats apparently just have good economic policy. We point to the fact that the Republicans in Mississippi, their analysis went as far as like there are Republicans in Mississippi. Mississippi is currently poor, therefore Republican economic policy must be dreadful. We point to actual factors that have locked Mississippi in cycles of poverty, like the fact they're resource poor, like the fact that their location just doesn't help with economic investment, like the fact that they still have a legacy of civil war. They have missed their causal link there. But if anything, and most importantly, the lower corporation taxes proposed by Republican candidates are exactly what will give these minorities the help that they need. But perhaps most prudently and most obviously, it's quite hard for me to access economic benefits at the point at which I'm likely to face incarceration at some point in my life as a black youth. It's quite hard for me as a woman to access economic benefits at the point at which I'm stuck with a child that I do not want and cannot care for because abortion is not condoned. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech and invite the negative reply speaker to conclude the team's case.
So apparently the Democratic Party is a bastion of Ivy League privilege that doesn't understand the South. But you know who does understand the South? The proposition. The lads from Oxford. They were a team who fundamentally misunderstood the politics of the South. They misunderstood how it actually worked. But worse than that, they're a team who are all too happy to throw minorities, like women, or LGBT groups, or African Americans under the bus. Minorities that we call minorities, but if you add them together, make up 70% of the population in these states. So probably quite an important stakeholder. Two areas in this debate. Firstly, you can look at economic policy. Secondly, social policy. So firstly, economic policy. They said the Republicans' economic policy is evil and terrible for places like Mississippi. They didn't say that much beyond that. They said Mississippi was poor, therefore this policy is evil. We said, are you certain about that? There's potentially lots of other reasons, historical reasons, geographical reasons, contextual reasons why Mississippi could be poor. And in fact, if you take their logic on its face, prima facie, they said Mississippi needs more investment. Lots of people would say a really great way to get that investment is by lowering corporation tax. Crucially, they never did enough to prove their burden, which the Republican economic policy is actively evil. We took more generally a sort of more agnostic style. Let's look a bit more closely, because they said voters are voting against their own interests. What did we say to that? We said, firstly, as Ed noted, if you actually look at the voting of polls in those states, they say Republicans win, that's because of social policy. If you actually ask these voters what kind of tax rates they support, you'll find they're broadly in line with the tax rates most Republicans support. They wanted to tell you about church groups and the Tea Party. We told you that Ben Carson is essentially a church-backed candidate who models his economic policy on biblical times. And you know what? His effective tax rate is 10%. We told you that the Tea Party stands for taxed enough already, and they said that was a religious group. Finally, though, we told you in Ed's speech that actually, if these people are seen as Democrats in disguise, they're likely not to be believed by these people anyway. So they never proved that this policy was fundamentally going to be in the interest of the South, or that voters would actually shift meaningfully the South. So on that basis alone, it falls. Moreover, what we told you, though, consistently down the case, insofar as there's a problem, it's a problem that's going to be fixed in 30 years when you have huge amounts of younger voters who are currently really quite pro-Democrat growing older, when you have huge amounts of Hispanic immigration. If there even is a problem, we get rid of it. Beyond just that, though, under economic policy, that was state economic policy. They didn't engage with our analysis about presidential elections, why those were also so important for economic policy. When we told you activism networks are hugely scuppered at the point at which you think basically your leaders are endorsing two separate people. When the Democrats are seen as disconnected from economic policy, given so much fiscal policy is done at the federal level by groups like the president, if they can't capture the White House, they have some serious problems. Secondly, though, let's look at what happened with social issues. Because ultimately, the very best case, like macroeconomics, is to an extent voodoo. So the impacts, insofar as they exist, are going to be comparatively probably more minimal the impacts for our social policies. Let's look at the impacts we actually got for our social policy. I told you the point at which the Democrats, or the New Democrats, the populists, whatever the hell they're called, essentially ditched the agenda, that essentially all the local election wins you get in city mayoral elections, small districts and so on, you all lose places where you can push a progressive social agenda. You don't have icons like Wendy Davis, who may not have passed a law, but certainly changed the consciousness of a hell of a lot of Americans. We had Rosa, furthermore, telling you what happens when people feel excluded from politics, when LGBT people feel that no one in the political space is actually able to represent them and their needs, feel afraid to come out because every single person running tells them you're not legitimate, your views don't matter. We also had Rosa telling you that you hugely remove the activist space for any kind of progressive politics at the point at which you have all of these policies, when black people feel that there's no one necessarily there to advocate them in America. What did we hear from them? We heard it's fine, economic determinism, economic trumps everything. We said that's probably not true for all the reasons we told about economics, but even if it is, it's very hard to access these nebulous economic gains if you're in prison because of racist imprisonment policy. It's very hard if you're in the closet and find it very hard to work because you live in a homophobic state. It's even harder if you're trying to raise a child as a single mother who didn't necessarily want to be able to have and didn't consent to have because you weren't able to get an abortion. The proposition was ultimately a team who was unclear about lots of things, but clear that they knew things better than the South. They're a team that was all too happy to throw minorities under a bus, not listen and not care to the interests of LGBT people, African Americans, and women. We are incredibly proud to oppose.